They built the largest contiguous land empire in human history. They shattered the walls of the most fortified cities on Earth. They rewrote the genetic map of Asia and Eastern Europe. And then, in the span of a single century, they vanished, absorbed, fractured, and forgotten by the very lands they had conquered. That is not a story of conquest. That is a story of something far stranger and far more disturbing. Most people know the name Genghis Khan. Fewer people know that his real name was Temujin, and that he spent the first 40 years of his life as a nobody. No palace, no army, no empire. Just a boy in the Mongolian steppe who watched his father get poisoned and his family abandoned by every clan that was supposed to protect them. The man who would eventually command armies that stretched from the Pacific Ocean to the gates of Vienna grew up catching rats to survive the winter. What he built from that starting point is not just military history. It is a case study in the most lethal combination known to human civilization, a system of radical meritocracy wrapped inside total, uncompromising violence. The year is 1162. Somewhere in the windswept grasslands of northern Mongolia, a land of bone-cracking winters and short, brutal summers where nothing grows easily and nothing survives without fighting for it. The air smells of horse, smoke, and wet leather. A man named Yasugai, chieftain of the Kamag Mongol clan, rides back to his camp with a prisoner tied across his saddle, a rival warrior named Temujin of the Tartars, captured that morning in a skirmish across the river. When Yasugai arrives home, his wife is in labor. The child is born with a blood clot clenched in his fist, which the Mongols interpret as a sign. This child will be a warrior. And so Yasugai names his newborn son after the man he just defeated. He calls him Temujin. Nobody in that camp that day could have imagined what that name would eventually mean, not just to the Mongols, to the entire world. This video is the complete story of how that child became Genghis Khan, how his descendants built an empire that touched 4 continents, and how that empire collapsed from the inside out in 4 completely different ways, each one a lesson in what happens when a system built for war has to learn to live in peace. By the end of it, you will understand not just what the Mongols did, you will understand why no empire built on the same foundations has ever survived its own success. Before we dive in, if you are the kind of person who wants the real story of history, the tactics, the terrain, the blood and the dust, and the political genius and the catastrophic failures, hit that subscribe button and join us. Drop a comment below and tell me where in the world you were watching from. This is a story that belongs to all of us, and we are going to tell it properly. Mongolia in the 12th century was not a country. It was not even a coherent political unit. It was a collection of clans, dozens of them, scattered across a landscape the size of Western Europe, connected by shared language and shared enemies, and almost nothing else. The Merkits were there, the Naimans, the Tatars, the Karaites, and the Kamag Mongols, who considered themselves the rightful rulers of the steppe, but had the military strength to back up exactly none of that claim. These clans fought constantly, not for ideology, not for religion, not for the kinds of abstract principles that motivate modern wars. They fought for survival, for horses, for grazing land, for women to replenish populations bled out by the previous winter. Alliances formed and shattered in a single season. Loyalty lasted only as long as it was profitable. A man who was your brother-in-law in spring could be your enemy by autumn if the weather turned bad and his herd was starving. This was the world Temujin was born into, and for the first 9 years of his life, he was protected inside it, the son of a clan chief, raised with the expectation of eventual leadership, given a future. Then his father rode out one afternoon to arrange a betrothal for him and stopped to share a meal with a group of Tatar tribesmen. The Tatars poisoned him. Yasugai rode home but never recovered. He died within days. Temujin was 9 years old. His brothers were younger. His mother, a woman named Heulan, suddenly found herself a widow with no male protector in a world that treated unprotected women as property. The clan elders made a simple calculation. Temujin was too young to lead them. They abandoned the family, left them on the steppe with nothing but their tent and whatever food they could find themselves. For the next several years, Temujin and his family survived on roots, berries, and small game. His mother taught him how to fish through ice. His brothers caught marmots with their bare hands. There are accounts, some likely embellished but telling nonetheless, of Temujin murdering his own half-brother over a fish, an act of violence that reveals not cruelty, but desperation. When your family is starving, a fish is not food, it is survival itself. These years shaped Temujin in ways that no palace education could have. He learned that loyalty had to be earned, never assumed. He learned that blood ties meant nothing when resources ran out. He learned that the system he had been born into, the clan hierarchy, the inheritance of power, the assumption that family connection determined your rank, was a system designed by the people at the top to keep everyone else in place. And he had been placed at the very bottom. He did not forget any of it. He was not built to forget. But here is where it gets interesting. Because while the story of Temujin's childhood is usually told as a story of suffering that forged a great man, the deeper truth is more complicated. His suffering gave him something that no son of a powerful chief could have gotten through inheritance. It gave him a worldview. And that worldview would become the foundation of the most effective military and administrative machine the pre-modern world had ever seen. Around the age of 16, Temujin began doing what every young Mongol man of ambition did. He started building alliances. His first move was to find his childhood betrothed, a girl named Borte from the contiguous clan. Her father had agreed to the match years earlier when Yasuge was still alive and powerful. Temujin arrived at her father's camp with nothing, no horses, no cattle, no warriors, just his name and the memory of a dead man's handshake. Against all expectation, Borte's father honored the agreement. Temujin left with a wife and, more crucially, a connection to the contiguous clan. Then the Merkits raided his camp and took Borte. For most men in his position, that would have been the end of the story. You do not recover from that. You do not raise an army to fight the Merkits when you have 3 warriors and a borrowed horse. But Temujin understood something that his contemporaries did not. An insult is a resource if you know how to use it. He went to Togrul, the powerful chief of the Karaite tribe and an old ally of his dead father, and he offered a simple proposition. Help me get my wife back, and I will be your loyal subordinate. He sealed the deal with the wedding gift Borte's family had given him, a coat of black sable fur, the most valuable object he owned. Togrul agreed. They launched a night raid on the Merkit camp, rescued Borte, and in the process, Temujin demonstrated for the first time the quality that would define his entire career. He did not just win. He remembered who had helped him and who had not. He rewarded his allies with a generosity that was almost shocking by the standards of steppe warfare, and he made a mental note about everyone who had stood against him. Over the next 2 decades, Temujin's reputation grew. Warriors from broken clans, men who had no future under the existing hierarchy, began attaching themselves to him. He gave them something the traditional system never offered, the possibility of advancement based on what you could do, not who your father was. A brilliant tactician born to a low-ranking family could become a general under Temujin. A skilled administrator from a conquered tribe could run a province. The best generals could eat at his table. This was revolutionary, and it was also ruthlessly self-interested. The people who rose through Temujin's system owed everything to him. Their status, their wealth, their survival itself, all of it was contingent on his approval. He had not just built an army, he had built a machine that converted loyalty into competence and competence into loyalty, with no gap between them. By 1204, Temujin was powerful enough to destroy his last major rivals on the steppe, the Naiman clan. Their warriors became his warriors. Their princesses entered his family through strategic marriage. Their chief's former subjects swore allegiance to the man who had just crushed their world. And 2 years later, in 1206, all the leaders of the Mongolian steppe assembled in the valley of the Onan River for a great Kurultai, a council, and did something that had never happened before. They elected a single great Khan over all Mongol peoples. They elected Temujin. And from that day forward, the world would know him by a different name, Genghis Khan, what we call Genghis Khan, universal ruler. We need to stop here and correct something that almost every account of the Mongol conquests gets wrong. The popular image of the Mongol army is a screaming horde of horsemen charging across the steppe, overwhelming enemies through sheer numbers and ferocity. This image is not just incomplete, it is almost entirely backwards. The Mongols were frequently outnumbered. In almost every major engagement of the conquest period, they faced armies larger than their own. When they invaded the Jurchen Jin dynasty of northern China, one of the most powerful military states on earth at the time, they were attacking a civilization with a population of roughly 50 million people, with an army of perhaps 100,000 warriors. When they swept through Central Asia, they were fighting established empires with professional armies, fortified cities, and centuries of accumulated military tradition. They won anyway. And the reason they won reveals something important, not about Mongol ferocity, but about Mongol intelligence. The Mongol military system rested on 3 innovations that in combination had never existed before. The first was mobility. A Mongol soldier lived on his horse. He slept on it, ate on it, traveled sometimes 60 miles a day on it. Each warrior maintained a string of horses, typically 3 to 5, sometimes more, rotating between them so that the animals never fully exhausted. An army that could move like this did not fight the way other armies fought. It did not form a battle line and stand there waiting to absorb a charge. It appeared, struck, and vanished before the enemy could react, and then appeared again somewhere the enemy had not expected. The second innovation was communication. The Mongol army used a system of relay riders and signal flags that allowed commanders to coordinate movements across distances that would have made communication impossible for any other medieval army. Genghis could split his force into 3 or 4 columns separated by 100 miles and have them converge on a single point at a predetermined time with a precision that his enemies found incomprehensible. To the people being invaded, it looked like the Mongols were everywhere simultaneously. That was not an accident. That was a system. The third innovation was the willingness to learn. This is the one that historians most frequently undervalue. Genghis Khan was not interested in Mongol pride. He was interested in winning. When he encountered a military technology or technique that was superior to his own, he adopted it without hesitation and integrated it into his system. From the Chinese, the Mongols learned siege warfare, catapults, trebuchets, firebombs, and the engineering knowledge to undermine city walls. From the Persians, they absorbed administrative techniques for governing occupied territory. From the Uyghurs, they borrowed a writing system and the bureaucratic expertise to manage supply chains across thousands of miles. By the time the Mongol army marched on a major city, it was not simply a cavalry force anymore. It was a combined arms operation that included horse archers, heavy cavalry, Chinese siege engineers, Uyghur administrators, and Persian translators, all functioning within a single chain of command. This was, in military terms, something genuinely new in the world. History remembers what happened next. What it forgets is why. There was also a psychological dimension that is almost always missed. The Mongols weaponized information. Before every major campaign, Mongol agents, spies, merchants, traveling monks would enter the target territory and spend months mapping its roads, its water sources, its political divisions, its internal grievances. By the time the army arrived, Genghis knew which local governors hated each other, which merchants resented the ruling class, which religious minorities had been persecuted and might welcome a change of power. He used these fractures the way a surgeon uses a scalpel. And then there was the terror policy. The Mongols offered every city they approached a simple choice: surrender, pay tribute, and be left largely intact, or resist and be utterly destroyed. When cities chose resistance, the Mongols followed through with a completeness that was designed to send a message to every city that came next. Merv, one of the great cities of the medieval Islamic world, was erased. Nishapur was leveled so thoroughly that the Mongols reportedly stacked the skulls in pyramids outside the ruins. These were not acts of rage, they were calculated announcements. The message reached the next city before the army did. The result was that many cities simply opened their gates. The Mongols conquered Central Asia in part because word traveled faster than cavalry, and the word was always the same: resistance is extinction. The first major test of the new Mongol war machine came from the south. The Jurchen Jin dynasty controlled northern China, a civilization of staggering wealth and military sophistication, sitting behind the Great Wall, protected by hundreds of thousands of professional soldiers and an administrative tradition stretching back 2,000 years. When Genghis Khan turned his attention toward them in 1211, every strategic calculation said he should not win. He won anyway. But not the way you might expect. The Mongols could not punch through fortified city walls with cavalry alone. They knew this, so they did not try. Instead, Genghis deployed a strategy of systematic devastation of the countryside, burning farms, destroying irrigation systems, killing or scattering the agricultural labor force that kept the cities fed. The Jin dynasty had the walls to keep the Mongols out. They did not have the rural infrastructure to survive indefinitely behind those walls. City after city fell not to assault, but to starvation. When siege expertise became available, captured Chinese engineers who knew how to build and deploy the weapon systems their former masters had used, the Mongols added it directly to their arsenal. The city of Zhengdu, the Jin capital, fell in 1215 after years of pressure. Genghis Khan rode into a city of perhaps 1 million people. The smoke from the burning districts was reportedly visible for 30 miles. But the Jin campaign was a slow grind compared to what happened next in Central Asia, and it is the Central Asian campaign that reveals Genghis Khan at his most terrifying and most calculating. The Khwarezmian Empire was, by 1218, the dominant power between Persia and India. Its ruler, Shah Muhammad II, commanded an army of 400,000 soldiers. Its cities, Samarkand, Bukhara, Urgench, were among the wealthiest and most cultured in the Islamic world, centers of scholarship and trade, whose libraries held manuscripts that would not be replicated for centuries. Genghis had no particular quarrel with the Khwarezmians. He sent them a trade delegation, proposing a commercial relationship between their empire and his. The governor of Otrar, a Khwarezmian border city, executed the delegation and seized their goods. Shah Muhammad did not punish him. When Genghis sent a second embassy to demand justice, Muhammad had one of the Mongol ambassadors killed and the others sent back with their beards shaved off, a profound humiliation in Mongolian culture. Is where the story turns dark. What followed was not a war. It was an extinction event for a civilization. Genghis assembled an army of somewhere between 100,000 and 200,000 warriors and split it into 4 columns that moved simultaneously through the Khwarezmian Empire from multiple directions. Shah Muhammad, commanding 4 times that number, made the catastrophic decision to distribute his forces across the empire's many cities rather than concentrating them for a decisive engagement. He was afraid of losing a single battle. The result was that he lost every battle. Bukhara fell in early 1220. Genghis reportedly rode his horse into the Great Mosque, and when a scholar explained that this was the house of God, Genghis replied, according to accounts written by those who survived, that God had delivered it into his hands, which meant God had found something to punish there. Whether he actually said this matters less than the fact that survivors believed he said it. The psychological effect was the same. Samarkand, the empire's greatest city, surrendered after a brief siege. The governor of Otrar, who had started the entire catastrophe, was executed by having molten silver poured into his eyes and ears, a poetic symmetry that Genghis very deliberately arranged. Shah Muhammad fled across his disintegrating empire, chased by two of Genghis's greatest generals, Jebbe and Subutai, across Persia, into Azerbaijan, through the Caucasus, and ultimately to a small island in the Caspian Sea, where he died of pneumonia and despair, alone, wrapped in a borrowed shirt because he owned nothing else. The Khwarezmian Empire ceased to exist in less than 3 years. Cities that had stood for centuries were reduced to rubble and ash. The agricultural systems of Central Asia, the irrigation networks that had sustained human civilization in those deserts for millennia, were destroyed so completely that some regions would not recover for 200 years. And Genghis Khan was 60 years old. He had decades of this behind him and would die before he could finish the Chinese campaigns he had already started. In 1227, Genghis Khan died on campaign against the Western Xia dynasty in northwestern China. The circumstances of his death are obscure by design. The Mongols kept it secret and buried him in an unmarked grave in the mountains near the Onan River, killing everyone who witnessed the funeral procession to preserve the location. The grave has never been found. He left behind an empire that stretched from the Pacific coast to the Caspian Sea. He also left behind a problem that he had deliberately failed to solve: succession. Genghis had established that only his direct descendants could rule the empire. Within that constraint, the choice of successor required a great kurotai, a unanimous agreement among all the senior Mongol leaders. This was a stabilizing mechanism in theory. In practice, it meant that every time a great Khan died, the empire stopped moving while its leadership class negotiated, maneuvered, and occasionally killed each other over who came next. The first transition went relatively smoothly. After 2 years of deliberation, the empire chose Genghis's third son, Ogedei, a capable administrator and competent military mind who understood that the empire needed consolidation as much as expansion. Ogedei Khan inherited his father's machine and used it well. He finished the destruction of the Jin dynasty in 1234. He launched the invasion of Eastern Europe that brought Mongol armies to the gates of Vienna. He oversaw the construction of Karakorum, the Mongol capital, transforming a nomadic empire into something that at least resembled a permanent state. But Ogedei drank himself to death in 1241, and the succession crisis that followed was not just a political inconvenience, it changed the history of Europe. In the winter of 1241, the greatest Mongol general of the post-Genghis era, a man named Subutai, the same commander who had chased Shah Muhammad across half of Asia, had his European campaign in the most dominant military position the continent had ever seen. He had destroyed the Polish and Hungarian armies at Legnica and Mohi in the same week. He had crossed the frozen Danube. He was camped on the outskirts of what is now Vienna, and his scouts had reached the Adriatic Sea. The road to the heart of Western Europe was open. Then the message arrived. Ogedei was dead. Every senior Mongol commander was required to return to Mongolia for the Kurotai. Subutai turned around, and Western Europe, which had absolutely no military force capable of stopping him, was spared by an accident of timing that has almost no parallel in history. Think about what that means for a moment. The Mongols did not stop at Vienna because they ran out of horses, or because the terrain defeated them, or because European knights were too formidable to break. They stopped because their ruler died and their political system required their physical presence at a location 10,000 miles away. The survival of medieval European civilization was at least in part a consequence of a drinking problem and a legal technicality. The empire never returned to Europe in force, not because it couldn't, because the succession struggles that followed Ogedai's death kept reorienting Mongol military priorities inward. Gayuk Khan, Ogedai's son, lasted 2 years before dying in 1248. Mongke Khan, who followed after a brutal factional struggle, was the last ruler to command genuine loyalty across the whole empire. He extended Mongol control into the Middle East, destroying the Abbasid Caliphate and sacking Baghdad in 1258, an event so traumatic to the Islamic world that it is still discussed in terms of civilizational catastrophe, the end of a golden age of Islamic scholarship. But Mongke died on campaign in China in 1259, and the election that followed did not produce a winner. It produced a civil war. The battle for succession after Mongke's death was not simply a political dispute. It was the visible expression of a contradiction that had been building inside the Mongol Empire from the moment it outgrew the steppe. The Mongols had built their empire on a nomadic foundation. They were herders, raiders, riders, people whose entire culture was organized around mobility, impermanence, and the collective life of the horde. But empire requires exactly the opposite. Empire requires cities, administrators, fixed borders, tax systems, courts, laws, bureaucracies. It requires people to stay in one place and manage complicated systems instead of riding over the horizon to find the next thing. For 3 generations, the Mongols had solved this problem by incorporating the administrative expertise of the people they conquered. Persian bureaucrats ran the Middle East. Chinese officials administered the eastern provinces. Uyghur scribes maintained the records. The Mongols provided military dominance and political authority. Everyone else provided the actual machinery of governance. But this arrangement had a long-term consequence nobody fully anticipated. The Mongols who governed Persia were slowly becoming Persian. The Mongols who administered China were slowly becoming Chinese. The Mongols who controlled Russia were integrating into the Turkic and Slavic cultures of the steppe. With each generation, the cultural distance between one branch of the ruling family and another grew wider. By the time of Mongke's death, the Mongols of China and the Mongols of Iran were not really the same people anymore. They shared ancestry, they did not share a world. The succession war between Kublai Khan and his brother Arikbuke was, at its core, a war between 2 incompatible visions of what the Mongol Empire was supposed to be. Arikbuke represented the traditionalist faction, Mongols who believed the empire should remain rooted in the steppe, governed according to nomadic customs, expanding through military conquest. Kublai represented something different, a Mongol prince who had grown up fascinated by Chinese civilization, who employed Chinese advisors, who had already decided that the future of his branch of the empire lay in Beijing, not in the tents of the Great Horde. Kublai won. Arikbuke surrendered in 1264 and died 2 years later under suspicious circumstances. But the victory was Pyrrhic in ways that only became clear in retrospect. The other branches of the empire, the Golden Horde in Russia, the Chagatai Khanate in Central Asia, and the Ilkhanate in Persia, refused to accept Kublai's authority as Great Khan. The formal unity of the Mongol Empire ended not with a single dramatic collapse, but with a quiet organizational reality. 4 separate empires, each ruling a different part of the conquered world, each developing along its own internal logic, with only the memory of a shared ancestor holding them together. And from this point forward, the story of the Mongols becomes 4 different stories, each one a different lesson in how power fails. Kublai Khan, now ruling as emperor of the Yuan dynasty in China, made the boldest bet of his career. He decided that he would not just conquer China, he would become China. He moved his capital to what is now Beijing. He adopted Chinese court protocols. He commissioned Chinese-style architecture. He positioned himself not as a Mongol conqueror sitting on top of a conquered civilization, but as the legitimate son of heaven in the Chinese imperial tradition, a ruler whose authority came from the cultural framework of the civilization he governed, rather than from the military force that installed him. For a time, it worked brilliantly. The Marco Polo, who arrived at Kublai's court in the 1270s, found a civilization of staggering opulence, a city of 1 million people, a court of unimaginable wealth, a commercial network that stretched from the Pacific to the Mediterranean. Kublai oversaw the construction of the Grand Canal extensions that would feed northern China for centuries. He established a paper currency system that is recognizable as a precursor to modern monetary policy. But he could not stop being a Mongol entirely. The invasions of Japan, 2 of them in 1274 and 1281, both destroyed by typhoons that the Japanese would call kamikaze, divine winds, cost him enormous resources and prestige. The campaigns into Vietnam and Java accomplished little. The military instinct to keep expanding kept overriding the administrative logic of consolidation. And underneath the court splendor, the relationship between the Mongol rulers and the Chinese population they governed was never resolved. The Mongols maintained a rigid ethnic hierarchy. Mongols first, Central Asians second, Northern Chinese third, Southern Chinese last. Chinese scholars were excluded from the highest offices. Chinese cultural practices were tolerated but not respected. The civilization Kublai had worked so hard to inhabit still regarded him as an outsider wearing its clothing. Kublai died in 1294, obese and alcoholic, mourning Borte's death and having outlived 3 of his sons. The rulers who followed him were mostly unremarkable: short reigns, court intrigue, diminishing authority. By the 1340s, the Yuan dynasty was being hammered simultaneously by floods along the Yellow River, by a plague that ripped through the dense Chinese population with catastrophic efficiency, and by a tax burden that had been pushed past the breaking point by decades of expensive military adventures. The rebellion that ended Mongol rule in China began among peasants who had nothing left to lose. It grew into something much larger. In 1368, a former Buddhist monk named Zhu Yuanzhang, a man born to absolute poverty, a man who had survived by begging, led his armies into Beijing and proclaimed the Ming dynasty. The last Mongol emperor fled north into the steppe with the remnants of his court. The Yuan dynasty was over, and the man who ended it had more in common with Genghis Khan's early life than with Kublai's imperial grandeur. While Kublai was trying to become Chinese, the Golden Horde in Russia was attempting something equally contradictory, remaining Mongol in a landscape that would ultimately turn them into something else entirely. The Golden Horde's domain, the great grassland corridor stretching from Kazakhstan to the Carpathian Mountains, was in many ways the most natural Mongol territory outside of Mongolia itself. The open steppe gave the horde everything it needed: grazing land, mobility, the ability to maintain the nomadic lifestyle that was the foundation of Mongol military power. The Russian principalities they ruled were conquered by 1240 and forced into a tributary relationship, paying regular taxes, providing soldiers when called, hosting Mongol administrators, and submitting their princes to the humiliation of making the long journey to the Mongol capital to have their authority ratified. For a century, this system worked. The Russian princes found that cooperation with the Mongols was more profitable than resistance. Those who navigated the relationship skillfully, providing tribute reliably, occasionally informing on rival princes, marrying their daughters into Mongol families, received military backing, favorable tax treatment, and the political legitimacy that came from Mongol patronage. One of the Russian princes most adept at this game was Alexander Nevsky, who is remembered today as a hero of Russian resistance. What is less frequently noted is that his political survival depended heavily on his willingness to collaborate with the Golden Horde against his Russian rivals. But the Golden Horde was fracturing from within. The succession problem that had plagued the empire at the top level was replicated at every tier of the Horde's internal structure. Clan leaders fought each other for influence. The tribute system that was supposed to maintain the loyalty of the Horde's leaders became increasingly inadequate as the empire stopped expanding and new plunder stopped flowing. Without conquest to redistribute, the internal competition for existing resources intensified. By the 14th century, the Golden Horde was experiencing a crisis of identity as much as a crisis of governance. The Mongol leaders had converted to Islam. They had adopted the Turkic language of the majority population they ruled. Their cultural practices had blended with those of the steppe Kipchaks. They were still calling themselves Mongols, still claiming the legitimacy of Chinggisid descent, but the civilization they embodied was no longer recognizably Mongolian. Then came the Black Death, arriving along the Silk Road trade routes in the late 1340s and moving through the Horde's densely packed camps with terrible efficiency. Then came Timur, Tamerlane, a Central Asian warlord of Turco-Mongol heritage who invaded the Golden Horde's territory in a series of devastating campaigns in the 1390s, not to conquer, but to destroy. He systematically dismantled the Horde's commercial infrastructure, burned its cities, scattered its population. The Golden Horde never recovered. Meanwhile, the Russian Principality of Moscow was quietly doing everything the Mongols had taught them to do: collecting tribute, building administrative infrastructure, eliminating rivals through a combination of military force and careful diplomacy. In 1480, the Grand Prince of Moscow simply stopped paying tribute to the Horde. The Horde gathered an army and marched to enforce compliance. The two armies faced each other across the Ugra River for weeks. Then the Horde withdrew. Nobody knows exactly why. Perhaps their supplies ran out. Perhaps internal divisions made the campaign untenable. Perhaps the leaders simply calculated that the cost of forcing compliance was higher than the tribute they would collect. Russia was free. The Golden Horde fragmented into a half-dozen successor khanates. Over the next 3 centuries, Russian armies absorbed them one by one. The last, the Crimean Khanate, was annexed by Catherine the Great in 1783. 541 years after the Mongols had first swept across the Russian steppe. Of the 4 successor states, the Ilkhanate in Persia and the Middle East had perhaps the most dramatic trajectory, the highest heights, and the most complete collapse. When Hulagu Khan, Genghis's grandson, destroyed Baghdad in 1258 and killed the Abbasid Caliph by wrapping him in felt and having horses trample him, the traditional Mongol method of executing royalty without spilling sacred blood, he eliminated the symbolic center of the Islamic world. The Caliph was not just a political leader. He was, in theory, the successor of the Prophet, the spiritual authority over all Sunni Muslims. His death sent a shockwave through Islamic civilization that contemporaries struggled to process. Writers who survived described it as the end of the world, as a rupture in the fabric of sacred history. Hulagu's army then moved into Syria, and here, for the first time, the Mongol advance met a force it could not simply overwhelm. The Mamluks were military slaves, a caste of soldiers, mostly of Turkic and Caucasian origin, who had converted to Islam and risen to rule Egypt through a tradition of martial excellence that was in some ways comparable to the Mongols' own meritocratic military culture. Their sultan, Qutuz, and his brilliant general, Baybars, had studied the Mongol tactics carefully. They understood that the Mongol advantage lay in open ground and the ability to maneuver. So they chose Ain Jalingt, a narrow valley in Palestine, and they waited. There is an extraordinary irony at the heart of the Battle of Ain Jalut in 1260 that almost every account misses. Baibars, the man who broke the Mongols, used tactics that were fundamentally Mongolian: feigned retreat to draw the enemy out of formation, coordinated cavalry strikes from multiple directions, rapid communication between separated units. He had learned from the people he was about to defeat. The Mongols lost not to a superior civilization, but to a military culture that had successfully absorbed their own innovations. But the Ilkhanate's deeper problem was ecological as much as military. The Middle East was not good Mongol country. The vast herds of horses that the Mongol military system required needed grassland, enormous quantities of it. Persia and Mesopotamia had some, they did not have enough. The Ilkhanate was perpetually underpowered relative to its territory, perpetually short of the horses and pasture that were the fundamental requirement of Mongol military dominance. The Ilkhans converted to Islam in 1295 under Genghis Khan, a recognition that their long-term survival depended on integration rather than dominance. Ghazan was actually a capable ruler who rebuilt some of the agricultural infrastructure his predecessors had destroyed and reformed the tax system. But his successors were not of his quality, and the Ilkhanate died not with a dramatic battle, but with a succession crisis so complete that by 1335 there was simply no one left to wear the crown. The last Ilkhan died without an heir. The territory dissolved into competing local dynasties, most of which were more Persian than Mongol. The Chagatai Khanate, ruling Central Asia from its founding in 1227, had the most paradoxical fate of the four successor states. It lasted the longest in some form. It produced the most remarkable individual successor, and it ended the most quietly. Central Asia was, ecologically speaking, the best Mongol territory outside of Mongolia itself. The great grasslands of the interior gave the horde the pasture it needed. The Silk Road cities, Samarkand, Bukhara, Kashgar, provided taxable wealth without requiring the Mongols to fundamentally change their lifestyle. For a century, the Chagatai Khanate maintained a kind of uneasy balance between nomadic tradition and urban administration. Then came a figure who complicates every simple narrative about the Mongol legacy. Timur, known in the West as Tamerlane, a corruption of Timur Ilang, Timur the Lame, was not a Mongol by birth. He was a Turkic Muslim from a minor noble family in what is now Uzbekistan. But he was Chinggisid by marriage and Mongol by cultural aspiration, and he spent 40 years building an empire that was, in many ways, a deliberate recreation of the Mongol conquest. The same mobility, the same terror tactics, the same devastating effectiveness against fortified positions, the same policy of offering mercy to those who surrendered and extinction to those who resisted. Timur's campaigns between 1370 and his death in 1405 covered a territory comparable to the original Mongol conquests. He destroyed the Golden Horde, sacked Delhi, swept through Persia and Mesopotamia, and defeated the Ottoman Turks at Ankara in 1402 in a battle that temporarily derailed the Ottoman conquest of Constantinople. When he died in 1405, he was preparing to invade China. His successors, the Timurids, created one of the great Renaissance cultures of the Islamic world, a civilization of extraordinary art, architecture, and scholarship centered on Samarkand and Herat that influenced Mughal India, Ottoman Turkey, and Safavid Persia. One of Timur's descendants, a man named Babur, who lost Central Asia to the rising Uzbek Confederation, moved south and founded the Mughal Empire in India in 1526. The Mughal Empire would last until the British formalized their control in the 19th century. The Chagatai Khanate itself was absorbed by the Dzungar Confederation in the 18th century and ultimately became part of the Qing Chinese Empire. It ended not as the Golden Horde did, in dramatic military collapse, but in a slow cultural dissolution. the Mongol identity of its ruling class diluted across generations until it was no longer the defining characteristic of anything. What does it mean that the largest contiguous land empire in history lasted less than 2 centuries? The standard answer is that empires inevitably decline, that overextension, succession crises, and the difficulties of governing diverse populations across vast distances make collapse inevitable. This is true as far as it goes, but it does not fully explain the Mongols, because the Mongols did not just decline, they disappeared. The successors of Genghis Khan did not produce a successor civilization that identified as Mongol. They produced China, Russia, Persia, India, the Ottoman world. They were absorbed into the civilizations they had conquered rather than transforming those civilizations permanently into something recognizably Mongolian. This is the paradox at the heart of the Mongol legacy. They were the most militarily successful empire in history and one of the least culturally durable. They conquered everyone. No one became them. The reason for this, I think, lies in the nature of what the Mongols actually were. They were not a civilization. They were a military system attached to a cultural tradition that was, by design, absorptive rather than projective. The Mongols did not build temples to their own gods in the cities they conquered. They did not impose a Mongol language on subject populations. They did not create a Mongol art tradition or a Mongol philosophical school or a Mongol literature that demanded adoption. They adopted the cultures around them, and eventually those cultures absorbed them. The Mongols created the Pax Mongolica, a century or more of relative stability across the trade routes of Eurasia that allowed ideas, technologies, and goods to move between China and Europe with an ease that had not existed before and would not exist again until the age of European maritime exploration. The Black Death, which killed perhaps a third of Europe's population, traveled those same trade routes. So did the knowledge of paper and printing and gunpowder and pasta. The connected world that emerged from the Mongol century was both more prosperous and more lethal than anything that had come before. There is a genetic dimension to the Mongol legacy that is almost impossible to fully comprehend. A 2003 study in genetics estimated that approximately 16 million men alive today are direct patrilineal descendants of Genghis Khan, that roughly 1 in 200 men on Earth carries the Y chromosome of the man who was born in a Mongol tent in 1162 with a blood clot clenched in his fist. No other individual in recorded history has left a comparable biological mark on the human species. What does that mean? It means that the Mongol conquests produced, among their many other consequences, a forced demographic transformation of entire regions. It is a number that requires sitting with, not celebrating, not condemning, sitting with, because it tells you something about the scale of what happened that no account of battles or political systems can. Fully convey the question that historians have debated for centuries, was Genghis Khan a monster or a visionary, is probably the wrong question. He was a system builder, operating with total ruthlessness inside a specific context, and the system he built was so effective that it outran the context that had produced it. The nomadic military machine that conquered the known world had no stable answer to the question of what to do once the world was conquered. Conquest is a tactic, it is not a civilization. And in the end, the Mongols discovered what every purely military power eventually discovers. You can take the world by force, you cannot keep it that way. The boy who caught rats in the Mongolian winter to feed his family, who built an empire from nothing by making himself indispensable to everyone who followed him, who died on campaign at somewhere between 60 and 70 years old, still in the saddle. He is buried somewhere in the mountains near the river of his birth, in an unmarked grave that has never been found. The man who reshaped the world more completely than any individual before or since left no monument, no tomb, no fixed address, just the world he made. Which is, depending on how you look at it, either the ultimate legacy or the ultimate lesson in impermanence. Every empire believes it will last forever. The Mongols believed they were destined to conquer the whole world under one ruler. They came closer than anyone, and then they became the world they had conquered, fading into the civilizations beneath them like water into dry ground, leaving only the shape of the channels they had carved. We are still living in those channels today.